The frozen earth of Belgium cracked beneath their boots like brittle glass, each step a small violence against the December landscape. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell pressed his gloved hand against the stone wall of what remained of a farmhouse, feeling the centuries-old mortar crumble under his touch. Behind him, 7 men huddled in the skeletal remains of the building, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the sub-zero air. The Ardennes forest stretched before them, a dark cathedral of evergreens weighted down with snow that transformed the world into something ancient and merciless. It was December 20th, 1944, and the 101st Airborne Division had been holding Bastogne for 2 days. Mitchell had stopped counting the hours since they'd last seen hot food or felt warmth that didn't come from small fires they couldn't afford to keep burning. His unit, Easy Company, 3rd Battalion, had been tasked with defending the eastern approach to the town, a position that military strategists would later call strategically vital, and soldiers would simply call Hell's Doorstep. Private First Class Anthony Rousseau sat with his back against the wall, methodically cleaning his M1 Garand, despite the cold that made his fingers nearly useless. At 22, he was one of the youngest in the squad, but his hands moved with the practiced certainty of someone who understood that survival often came down to the smallest details. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, the son of Italian immigrants who'd instilled in him a work ethic that bordered on religious devotion. His father had pressed a small medal of St. Michael into his palm before he shipped out, whispering in Italian that the archangel protected warriors. Rousseau kept it in his breast pocket, checking for it compulsively whenever artillery fire grew close. "Sergeant," Rousseau said quietly, not looking up from his rifle, "you think they're really coming?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. He'd learned in the 18 months since Normandy that empty reassurances served no one. Instead, he studied the tree line, watching for movement that might betray German positions. The intelligence reports had been fragmentary at best. Something massive was happening, a German offensive of unprecedented scale, but the details remained maddeningly vague. What they knew for certain was that they were surrounded, cut off from supply lines, and facing an enemy force that outnumbered them by a margin no one wanted to calculate too precisely. "They're coming," Mitchell finally said. "Question is when and how many." Corporal David Henderson shifted his position near the empty window frame, his Springfield rifle resting across his knees. At 28, he was the oldest man in the immediate squad, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. His wife Margaret had written him letters every week without fail, each one carefully saved in a waterproof pouch he kept close to his heart. The most recent letter, dated 3 weeks ago, contained a photograph of their daughter Emma, now 4 years old, standing in front of their small house with a gap-toothed smile. Henderson studied that photograph every night before sleeping, committing every detail to memory as though the image itself could anchor him to the world he'd left behind. If you're watching this story unfold, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support keeps these important stories alive. The sound reached them before the visual confirmation, a low, mechanical rumble that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground itself. Mitchell raised his fist, the signal for absolute silence. 7 men froze, becoming as still as the stones around them. The rumble grew louder, accompanied now by the distinctive clank of tank treads. Through gaps in the shattered walls, they caught glimpses of movement. German Panzer IV tanks, 3 of them, advancing along the forest road with accompanying infantry spread out in textbook formation. "Jesus," whispered Private Tommy Walsh, a 19-year-old from Chicago, whose hands trembled slightly as he gripped his Browning automatic rifle. Walsh had been in the unit for only 6 weeks, a replacement for casualties sustained during Market Garden. He'd written to his mother that he was assigned to a supply depot, a lie that let them both sleep easier across the miles that separated them. Mitchell's mind raced through tactical calculations. Their position offered decent cover, but limited fields of fire. They had one bazooka with 3 rounds and ammunition for their rifles that would last through perhaps 2 sustained engagements. The nearest friendly position was 200 yards to their southwest, a gap that might as well have been 2 miles if the Germans established a strongpoint here. "Henderson," Mitchell said softly, "how's your angle on that lead tank?" Henderson studied the approaching column, his teacher's mind automatically calculating trajectories and angles. "Clear shot at about 80 yards if they maintain course." "But Sergeant, after the first shot, this place becomes a hornet's nest. I know." Mitchell turned to Private Samuel Johnson, a lanky farm boy from North Carolina who handled the bazooka with surprising grace. "Johnson, you're our priority target. First shot has to count. We disable that lead tank, create a choke point, maybe buy ourselves some confusion." Johnson nodded, his dark eyes steady, despite the fear that tightened the corners of his mouth. He'd grown up hunting deer in the Smoky Mountains, learning patience and precision from a grandfather who'd fought in the Great War. That training served him now as he positioned himself carefully, checking the weapon with hands that betrayed no tremor. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that metal became painful to touch with bare skin. Private Eddie Martinez, a mechanic from Texas with hands scarred from years working in his father's garage, whispered a prayer in Spanish as he readied grenades. He'd been the first in his family to leave their small border town, carrying with him their hopes and the weight of 3 generations who dreamed of proving their American credentials through service. Russo finished reassembling his rifle and took position beside Martinez. They'd formed an unlikely friendship during training, the Brooklyn Italian and the Texas Mexican, united by their outsider status among the predominantly Protestant Anglo-Saxon unit. They'd learned to trust each other absolutely, a bond forged in shared foxholes and midnight conversations about families they missed and lives they hoped to return to. The German column advanced steadily, the infantry moving with the mechanical precision that characterized Wehrmacht training. Mitchell counted approximately 30 soldiers accompanying the tanks, professional soldiers by the look of them, not the green recruits Germany had been increasingly forced to field. These men moved with confidence, weapons held ready, eyes scanning the landscape with veteran awareness. At 75 yards, Mitchell gave the signal. Johnson exhaled slowly, steadying the bazooka against his shoulder. The mathematics of the shot played out in his mind. Distance, wind, the angle of approach. His grandfather's voice echoed in memory. "Patience, Sam. Let the moment come to you." The rocket streaked through the cold air with a sound like tearing canvas. It struck the lead panzer just below the turret, exactly where Johnson had aimed. The explosion transformed the winter morning into brief, hellish brightness. The tank shuddered, smoke pouring from the impact point as flames began to lick at its exterior. The crew bailed out immediately, professional training overriding panic, but the tank itself blocked the narrow road, creating exactly the obstacle Mitchell had hoped for. The German infantry reacted instantly, dropping into defensive positions and returning fire that chewed chunks from the farmhouse walls. Mitchell's squad responded with disciplined volleys, each man choosing targets with the care of those who understood that every bullet might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Henderson's Springfield barked once, twice, 3 times. A German sergeant directing troops from beside the disabled tank crumpled. Walsh's bar chattered in controlled bursts, forcing advancing infantry to seek cover. Russo and Martinez worked in tandem, covering different approaches with overlapping fields of fire that turned the farmhouse perimeter into a killing zone. The second German tank attempted to maneuver around the disabled lead vehicle, its commander unwilling to sit idle while his infantry took casualties. Johnson was already repositioning, Walsh covering his movement with suppressing fire. The bazooka's second round caught the Panzer as it exposed its thinner side armor. The explosion was catastrophic. The tank's ammunition cooked off in a secondary blast that sent flames 30 feet into the air. But the third tank had found an angle. Its main gun traversed toward the farmhouse with terrible inevitability. Mitchell saw it happening in slow motion, understanding with crystal clarity that they had perhaps 3 seconds before 75 milliliters of high explosive reduced their position to rubble. "Out!" he screamed. "Everybody out now!" The men moved with desperate speed, abandoning the farmhouse through a gap in the rear wall. They drilled evacuation procedures countless times, muscle memory overriding the paralysis of fear. Henderson went first, then Walsh, Martinez, and Russo following in rapid succession. Johnson grabbed the bazooka and remaining ammunition. Private Billy Cooper, a quiet kid from Montana who rarely spoke but never faltered, snatched up their medical supplies and extra ammunition. The tank's gun fired just as Mitchell dove through the opening. The shell hit the farmhouse dead center, the explosion collapsing what remained of the structure in a thunderous cascade of stone and timber. The blast wave picked Mitchell up and threw him forward, slamming him into frozen earth hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. For several seconds, he couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world narrowed to the simple struggle to draw air into shocked lungs. Then sensation returned in a painful rush, the cold, the acrid smell of explosives, the scattered sounds of ongoing combat. Hands grabbed him, dragged him behind a low stone wall that bordered what had once been the farmhouse's garden. Henderson's face appeared above him, mouth moving in words Mitchell couldn't quite hear through the ringing in his ears. Then, gradually, sound returned. "With me, Sergeant." "James, can you hear me?" Mitchell nodded, testing his limbs. Everything hurt, but everything moved, nothing broken. Pure luck. He'd used up another life in a war that had already claimed too many. "I'm good," he managed, his voice sounding strange and distant. "The others, all accounted for. Cooper took some shrapnel in his leg, but he can move. We need to fall back to the secondary position." Mitchell forced himself to focus, pushing through the fog of concussion. The secondary position, a partially collapsed barn, approximately 150 yards southwest, closer to friendly lines, but with less natural cover. They'd scouted it 2 days ago as a fallback point, never really believing they'd need it. The German infantry was advancing more cautiously now, having learned respect for the Americans' defensive capabilities. But they were advancing nonetheless. And without the farmhouse, Mitchell's squad had lost its primary defensive position. The tactical situation had shifted from difficult to nearly impossible. "Leapfrog withdrawal," Mitchell ordered, his sergeant's training overriding the chaos. "Johnson, Walsh, Martinez, you're first bound. Move on my mark. Rest of us provide covering fire." The maneuver required perfect timing and absolute trust. 3 men would sprint toward the barn while 4 provided suppressive fire. Then the positions would reverse. It was a dance performed under the worst possible conditions, where a misstep meant death and hesitation meant failure. "Move!" Mitchell shouted. Johnson, Walsh, and Martinez broke from cover, running in a crouch across the exposed ground. Mitchell, Henderson, Russo, and Cooper opened up with everything they had, forcing the German infantry to keep their heads down. Bullets kicked up snow around the running men, but luck held. All 3 reached a depression in the ground that offered temporary cover. Now the positions reversed. Mitchell's group prepared to move while the others provided covering fire. But before they could start, Cooper grabbed Mitchell's arm, his young face pale with pain and fear. "Sergeant, I can't run, my leg!" Mitchell looked down and saw blood seeping through Cooper's trousers, more than he'd initially realized. The shrapnel had done more damage than a quick field assessment had revealed. Cooper could walk, maybe, but not sprint, not across 150 yards of open ground under fire. Henderson saw Mitchell's expression and immediately understood. "I'll carry him." "David, you can't—" "I'll carry him," Henderson repeated, with a finality that ended discussion. He handed his Springfield to Russo, then helped Cooper onto his back in a fireman's carry. The Montana kid weighed maybe 160, but across that distance, under fire, it might as well have been twice that. Mitchell made a split-second decision. "Russo, you're with Henderson. Cover his movement. I'll provide supporting fire with Walsh's group. Then we all extract together." It wasn't standard tactics, but standard tactics assumed circumstances that rarely existed in actual combat. They were making it up as they went, improvising survival from moment to moment. Henderson hefted Cooper's weight, found his balance, and nodded. Russo positioned himself to provide close cover. At Mitchell's signal, they moved. Henderson ran with the steady determination of a man who'd spent years coaching high school track teams. His legs pumped mechanically, his breathing controlled despite the weight on his back. Russo stayed close, his rifle sweeping for threats. German fire increased, rounds snapping past with that distinctive crack that meant they were missing by inches rather than feet. Mitchell fired until his M1's clip pinged empty, ejecting with that distinctive sound that marked every 8th round. He reloaded automatically, muscle memory performing tasks, while his conscious mind tracked Henderson's progress. 75 yards, 50, 25. Henderson stumbled, and Mitchell's heart stopped. But the teacher from Ohio caught himself, refusing to fall, refusing to quit. He reached the depression where Johnson and the others waited, carefully lowering Cooper before collapsing himself, chest heaving. Now only Mitchell remained at the stone wall, alone in what had been their defensive position. The German infantry was close now, close enough that he could see individual faces beneath their helmets. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who understood they'd won this particular engagement, who knew that the lone American couldn't hold them all. Mitchell fired his last rounds, each shot carefully placed, buying seconds. Then he dropped the empty M1, pulled his .45 pistol and ran. The Germans saw him moving and concentrated their fire, the air around him filled with supersonic cracks and the whistle of near misses. Snow erupted in small geysers where bullets struck. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. The distance seemed impossible, stretching out before him like something from a nightmare where you run and run but never reach safety. He thought about his wife Sarah, about the letter in his breast pocket that he'd read so many times the creases were wearing through. He thought about the farm in Iowa where he'd grown up, about the life he'd promised himself he'd return to. He thought about the 7 men depending on him to reach that depression, to lead them the rest of the way to safety. 50 yards, 40, 30. Something punched him in the shoulder, spinning him partially around. He stumbled but kept moving, understanding distantly that he'd been hit but unable to process the implications. 20 yards, 10. Hands reached out, grabbed him, pulled him down into the depression. Henderson's face appeared above him, speaking words Mitchell couldn't quite pass. He tried to respond, but the world was starting to grey at the edges. "Stay with us, Sergeant," Henderson was saying. "Stay with us. You got us this far. Don't quit now." Mitchell focused on the teacher's face, using it as an anchor against the pull of unconsciousness. "Get them to the barn," he managed. "We're all getting to the barn," Henderson replied firmly. "All of us, together." Private Martinez was already working on Mitchell's shoulder, using field dressings from Cooper's medical supplies. The bullet had passed through the meat of Mitchell's shoulder, missing bone and major blood vessels, through what could only be called divine intervention. It hurt like hellfire, but it wasn't fatal. not immediately anyway. Rousseau had taken temporary command, organizing their next bound, while Martinez worked. "Sir, that tank is repositioning for a clear shot at this depression. We've got maybe 60 seconds before we're in its sights." Mitchell forced himself upright, despite the pain that lanced through his shoulder. The fog in his mind cleared slightly, Sergeant's training reasserting itself. "Johnson, you still have one rocket left?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Then we're going to make it count. Henderson, Walsh, Cooper, start moving toward the barn now. Rousseau, Martinez, you're with them. Johnson and I will provide a distraction, then follow." Henderson started to protest, but Mitchell cut him off. "That's an order, Corporal. Get them to safety. We'll be right behind you." It was a calculated risk, possibly a suicide mission, but it gave the others their best chance. Henderson understood this with painful clarity. He nodded once, then helped Cooper up. Within seconds, 5 men were moving toward the barn, their figures dark against the white landscape. Mitchell and Johnson waited, watching the German tank maneuver for position. The infantry had grown more cautious after the losses they'd sustained, advancing in careful bounds that suggested professional training. But the tank was their immediate threat, 75 millimeters of American killing potential that would turn the depression into a crater if they didn't act. "Sam," Mitchell said quietly, using Johnson's first name for the first time, "I need you to make the shot of your life." Johnson's hands were steady as he positioned the bazooka, despite the cold, despite the fear, despite everything. "My granddad once shot a 12-point buck at 200 yards in a snowstorm," he said conversationally. "Always said it was about trusting your instincts more than your eyes." The tank emerged from behind the wreckage of the farmhouse, its commander probably feeling confident that the Americans were either dead or retreating. It was a mistake born of assumptions, the kind of error that combat punishes without mercy. Johnson didn't hesitate. His final rocket streaked across the intervening distance and struck the Panzer's thinner top armor. The explosion was everything Mitchell had hoped for, catastrophic, immediate, and completely disabling. The tank's turret actually lifted slightly from the force of the blast, ammunition cooking off in a spectacular display that sent the crew scrambling for escape. "Go!" Mitchell shouted. They ran together, leaving the bazooka behind as unnecessary weight. The German infantry, shocked by the destruction of their armored support, hesitated just long enough. Mitchell and Johnson covered the distance to the barn in what felt like both seconds and hours, every step an act of will against exhaustion and injury. The barn's interior offered minimal shelter, collapsed roof beams, rotting hay, walls punctured by previous artillery strikes. But it was cover, and it connected to a communication trench that led back toward friendly lines. Henderson had already organized a defensive perimeter, positioning the men to cover the approaches while preparing for immediate withdrawal. "Everyone accounted for," Mitchell gasped, his shoulder now a solid mass of pain. "Present, Sergeant," Rousseau confirmed. "Cooper's stable. Your shoulder needs proper medical attention, but you'll live." Mitchell allowed himself a moment of relief, a brief acknowledgement that they'd survived an engagement that should have killed them all. 8 men had held against overwhelming odds, inflicted significant casualties, and extracted themselves intact. It was the kind of minor miracle that happened when training, leadership, and pure, stubborn determination aligned. But they weren't safe yet. The sound of German forces regrouping carried clearly in the cold air. More troops would be coming, probably with better coordination and heavier weapons. This had been one battle in what was shaping up to be a prolonged siege. "We move in 5 minutes, Mitchell ordered. "Gather what ammunition we have left. Travel light, travel fast. Henderson, you're taking point. Rousseau, rear guard. We're going back to the main defensive line." As his men prepared, Mitchell allowed himself to think about what they'd just survived. 9 hours ago, they'd been a standard infantry squad holding a routine defensive position. Now they were veterans of an engagement that would feature in after-action reports, assuming anyone survived to write those reports. They'd proven something fundamental about what American soldiers could accomplish when pushed to the absolute limit. The retreat through the communication trench took 40 minutes that felt like hours. They moved in bounds, always maintaining security, never exposing more than 2 men at once. German patrols were active throughout the area, the sounds of combat echoing from multiple directions. The battle for Bastogne was entering its most critical phase. They encountered a 3-man patrol from Baker Company holding a crater that had been repurposed as a defensive position. The soldiers looked as exhausted and filthy as Mitchell's squad felt. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, but still functional. Still fighting. "Easy, company," one of them asked, a sergeant with a Kentucky accent. "What's left of us?" Henderson replied. "Situation at Battalion CP?" "Holding, barely. Germans hit us from 3 sides this morning. Lost contact with Charlie Company around dawn. Colonel says hold what we got. Reinforcements are coming." They both knew that reinforcements might mean anything from fresh divisions to ammunition resupply. The fog of war made accurate information nearly impossible, and rumors spread faster than facts. Mitchell's squad pushed on, finally reaching the battalion command post just after 1400 hours. The CP was established in the basement of a partially destroyed building, walls reinforced with sandbags and timber. Maps covered every available surface. Officers and NCOs bent over them in intense discussion. Major Robert Thompson looked up as Mitchell's squad filed in, his expression transitioning from concern to relief. "Mitchell, Christ, we thought you were overrun. Reports said the eastern approach was lost." "We complicated their timetable, sir," Mitchell replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. 3 panzers destroyed, maybe 30 infantry casualties. But they're regrouping. They'll come again stronger. Thompson nodded, studying the map with the grim intensity of a man calculating impossible odds. "They're hitting us everywhere. We're surrounded, cut off, and running low on everything that matters. Medical supplies, ammunition, food. Weather's too bad for air resupply." "What are our orders, sir?" Thompson looked at Mitchell with an expression that mixed respect and something that might have been apology. "Hold. That's it. Just hold. Every hour we keep them tied up here is an hour Patton's forces use to reach us. Every German soldier we pin down here is a soldier that can't be used somewhere else." It was the arithmetic of war reduced to its simplest form: bodies and time, sacrifice and strategy. Mitchell understood it intellectually, had accepted it when he'd taken his sergeant's stripes, but understanding and acceptance didn't make it easier. "My men need medical attention, sir. Private Cooper took shrapnel, and I caught a round in the shoulder. Get to the aid station, then grab whatever rest you can. I'm reassigning your squad to hold the church on the northeast perimeter. It's a potential breakthrough point if the Germans mass armor there." Mitchell wanted to protest, to argue that his men had already done more than could reasonably be asked, but he understood the necessity. Every able-bodied soldier mattered now. Every defensive position had to be manned. There were no reserves, no relief, no option except to hold or die trying. The aid station occupied what had once been a schoolroom, now transformed into a triage center that processed a steady stream of wounded. Medics worked with practiced efficiency, their hands stained with blood that no amount of washing ever completely removed. They'd learned to categorize injuries quickly, those who would die regardless of treatment, those who might survive with immediate care, and those who could wait. A tired-looking medic examined Mitchell's shoulder with gentle efficiency. "Clean pass-through. You got lucky, Sergeant. Few inches to the right, and you'd be looking at permanent nerve damage. As it is, you'll have a nice scar, and probably some reduced range of motion for a few weeks." The medic cleaned the wound with burning antiseptic, applied sulfur powder to prevent infection, and bandaged it tightly. Keep it clean, change the dressing twice a day if possible, and for God's sake don't do anything stupid like getting shot again. Mitchell managed a tired smile. I'll do my best. Cooper required more extensive treatment. The shrapnel had fragmented on impact, creating multiple wound channels that needed careful cleaning. But the damage was manageable, survivable. The kid would walk with a limp for a while, but he'd walk. After the aid station, Mitchell gathered his squad in a corner of the basement that served as their temporary rest area. 7 exhausted men, filthy and cold, sustained by nothing except the knowledge that others depended on them. Bulge was so young he still didn't need to shave regularly. Rousseau methodically cleaned weapons that had already been cleaned multiple times. Martinez muttered prayers in Spanish. Johnson sat silently, perhaps replaying the shots he'd made with the bazooka. Henderson wrote in a small journal he kept, documenting experiences he hoped to someday share with his daughter. "Listen up," Mitchell said quietly, drawing their attention. "I know you're all exhausted. I know the situation looks bad. But we're not done yet. Major Thompson is assigning us to hold the church on the northeast perimeter. It's a critical position, which means it's going to be a hard position. The Germans will come at us with everything they have." He paused, studying each face, seeing the fear they tried to hide and the determination they couldn't. "We've already proven we can hold against superior numbers. We've shown that American soldiers don't break just because the enemy thinks we should. Every hour we hold is an hour closer to relief. Every German we stop here is a German that doesn't threaten someone else's position. What I'm saying is this: we matter. What we do in the next hours and days matters. Not just for us, not just for this unit, but for everyone depending on us to hold this line. We're going to hold that church. We're going to make the Germans pay for every inch, and we're going to prove that courage and determination matter more than numbers." It wasn't a sophisticated speech, wasn't the kind of thing that would appear in history books or inspire poems, but it was real, honest, and it reflected the fundamental truth of their situation. They could surrender to despair, or they could fight. Everything else was just details. Rousseau was the first to respond. "We're with you, Sergeant, all the way." The others nodded agreement, their exhaustion momentarily pushed back by something more powerful, the bond between soldiers who'd faced death together and survived through collective will. They rested for 4 hours, grabbing whatever sleep exhaustion demanded. Mitchell dreamed of Sarah, of their small farm, of a life that seemed impossibly distant. He woke with her name on his lips, and the immediate reality of their situation crashing back. The church stood on a slight rise at the northeast edge of Bastogne's defensive perimeter, its stone walls pocked with shrapnel damage and its steeple reduced to a jagged stump by previous artillery strikes. It had been built in the 18th century, constructed to last, and those sturdy walls now served military necessity. The interior had been cleared of pews and religious fixtures, transformed into a defensive strongpoint with firing positions at windows and doors. Mitchell's squad took up positions as darkness fell on December 20th, their second night of the siege. Snow began falling again, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. In other circumstances, it might have been beautiful. In their current situation, it was simply another complication. Henderson established himself in the bell tower, using the elevation for observation despite the cold that made the position nearly unbearable. His teacher's mind automatically calculated fields of fire, blind spots, likely approaches. He'd written a final letter to Margaret before leaving the battalion CP, trying to explain things he couldn't quite articulate, how much he loved her, how much he missed Emma, how the thought of them gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. The night passed in tense waiting. They took turns on watch, 2-hour rotations that prevented anyone from getting truly restful sleep, but maintained constant vigilance. Small unit combat had taught them that attacks often came at dawn or dusk, when light conditions favored the attacker. But in this battle, with German forces pressing everywhere, attacks could come any time. December 21st dawned grey and bitterly cold. Intelligence reports, fragmentary and often contradictory, suggested the German offensive was achieving significant gains in other sectors. Entire American units had been overrun or forced to surrender. The situation was developing into the largest German offensive operation of the Western European campaign, catching Allied forces completely off guard. But Bastogne held. Against all reasonable expectations, the encircled garrison continued to resist, tying down German forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. The town had become a thorn in the Wehrmacht's operational plans, a problem that needed to be resolved before they could exploit their gains. At 07:30 hours, the Germans came for the church. Artillery struck first, not the massed barrage that preceded major offensives, but targeted fire meant to suppress defenders and create confusion. Shells impacted around the church, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and stone fragments. One struck the remaining portion of the steeple, bringing it down in a cascade of rubble that nearly caught Henderson before he scrambled to safety. Then came the infantry, advancing in 2 waves with tank support. Mitchell counted approximately 60 soldiers and 2 Panzer IVs, a serious assault force that suggested the Germans understood the church's tactical importance. "Hold fire until I give the word," Mitchell ordered. "Let them get close. Make every shot count." It was perhaps the hardest order to follow, watching enemy soldiers advance, knowing they intended to kill you, while forcing yourself to remain still and silent. It required discipline that separated trained soldiers from armed civilians. The Germans came within 50 yards, then 30. Their expressions were visible now, grim determination mixed with the careful wariness of veterans who'd learned not to assume anything in combat. They moved in proper formation, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. "Fire!" Mitchell shouted. 8 rifles opened up simultaneously, the concentrated firepower cutting through the front rank of German infantry like a scythe through wheat. Men fell, others dove for cover, the neat advance dissolving into chaos. Walsh's bar hammered out controlled bursts that forced the second wave to ground before they could properly deploy. The panzers rumbled forward, their main guns seeking targets. But the church's stone walls, built to last centuries, proved surprisingly resilient against high explosive rounds. Shells struck with tremendous force, shaking the structure, but failing to penetrate the thick masonry. Mitchell directed fire with the calm of long practice, calling out targets and coordinating fields of fire. They'd become a machine, 8 parts working in perfect synchronization. Rousseau and Martinez covered the left approach, Henderson and Walsh the right, while Johnson positioned himself to engage the tanks if opportunity presented. But they had no bazooka now, no anti-tank weapons, except grenades that required suicidal proximity to employ. The panzers represented a problem they couldn't solve through small arms fire alone. One tank maneuvered to fire directly through the church's main entrance, its commander probably intending to fill the interior with high explosive rounds until nothing remained alive. Johnson saw the maneuver developing and made a split-second decision that would haunt him the rest of his life. He grabbed 4 grenades, rigged them together with wire, and sprinted toward the tank's blind spot. It was insane, the kind of action that resulted from either extreme courage or complete desperation. Perhaps both. "Johnson, no!" Mitchell screamed, but the private was already moving. He closed to within 10 feet of the Panzer before the crew spotted him. Machine gun fire chewed the ground around him, but luck or divine intervention kept him untouched. He threw the improvised bundle directly into the tank's treads and dove away. The explosion wasn't large enough to destroy the Panzer, but it shattered the right tread, immobilizing the vehicle. The tank could still fire, but it couldn't maneuver. Johnson scrambled back toward the church, bullets kicking up snow around him, covering the distance through sheer desperation. Henderson provided covering fire, his Springfield barking methodically. Russo and Martinez added their weapons to the suppression. Johnson reached the church entrance and tumbled inside, panting, his hands shaking from adrenaline. "You goddamn fool," Mitchell said, but there was pride in his voice alongside the anger. "You magnificent goddamn fool." The battle raged for 2 hours. The Germans pressed their attack with professional persistence, trying multiple approaches, coordinating infantry and armor in textbook fashion. But the Americans held, trading casualties they couldn't afford for time they desperately needed. Bulge took a bullet through his upper arm, the round passing clean through without hitting bone. Martinez wrapped it quickly, and the kid kept firing, though his face had gone pale with shock. Cooper, still recovering from his leg wound, manned a position anyway, refusing to be useless. The 2nd Panzer withdrew after taking multiple hits from a friendly Sherman tank that appeared unexpectedly from the southwest. American armor was thin on the ground around Bastogne, making the Sherman's appearance almost miraculous. Its 75mm gun made quick work of the immobilized German tank, then provided supporting fire that convinced the enemy infantry to break contact and withdraw. The attack had been repulsed, but at cost. Mitchell's squad had expended most of their ammunition. Walsh and Cooper both needed medical attention beyond field dressings. They were exhausted, cold, hungry, and running on reserves they hadn't known they possessed. But they'd held. Against professional German soldiers supported by armor, 8 Americans had held a critical position and prevented a breakthrough that could have fractured Bastogne's defense. Major Thompson visited the church that afternoon, picking his way through rubble and spent brass casings. His face showed the strain of command during crisis, the weight of making decisions that meant life or death for hundreds of men. "Good work, Sergeant," he said simply. "You've bought us another day." "With respect, sir, we can't keep this up indefinitely. We're nearly out of ammunition, medical supplies are gone, and my men are approaching their limit." Thompson nodded. "I know. Intelligence suggests Patton's forces are pushing hard to reach us, but the weather's hampering their advance. We need to hold for possibly another 3 to 4 days. 3 to 4 days. It might as well have been 3 to 4 years. Mitchell looked at his exhausted squad, at men who'd already given everything, and wondered where they'd find the strength to continue. That night, as snow continued falling on the besieged town, Mitchell sat alone in the church's cold interior and finally allowed himself to acknowledge how close they'd come to failure, how thin the margin between survival and annihilation. He pulled out Sarah's letter, reading by the light of a carefully shielded candle. She wrote about the farm, about spring planting plans, about a future she believed they'd share. Her faith in his survival was absolute, unshakable, as though will alone could guarantee his safe return. Mitchell wished he could borrow some of that certainty, could believe as completely as she did that this nightmare would end with him walking up their farm's dirt road. Henderson appeared beside him, moving quietly despite his size. "Couldn't sleep either." "Too cold, too much adrenaline still in the system," Mitchell replied. "You should rest while you can." "Should. But thinking about Margaret and Emma, wondering if I'll ever see them again." Henderson pulled out the photograph he carried, studying it in the candlelight. "You ever think about what we'll do if we make it through this? After the war?" "Sometimes. Mostly I try not to think too far ahead. Seems like tempting fate. Margaret wants another kid, maybe 2. She's got it all planned out, house full of children, noise and chaos and love. When I'm here in this, I hold on to that vision like a lifeline, a future where we're not cold, not hungry, not afraid every second." Mitchell understood completely. The future, vague, uncertain, but infinitely preferable to the present, served as motivation when nothing else remained. It was why soldiers carried photographs, wrote letters, maintained connections to a world that seemed increasingly unreal. "We're going to make it, David," Mitchell said, trying to believe it himself. "All of us. We've come this far, we'll go the rest of the way." It was perhaps a lie, or perhaps a prayer, or perhaps simply the kind of thing you said when truth was too terrible to acknowledge. Henderson seemed to accept it anyway, nodding slowly before returning to his position. December 22nd brought no respite. German attacks continued around the perimeter, probing for weak points, testing American resolve. Mitchell's squad remained at the church, now reinforced by 6 additional soldiers from a decimated rifle platoon, 14 men total, holding a position designed for twice that number. Supplies arrived in the form of a single ammunition resupply, enough to continue fighting, not enough to feel secure. Food remained scarce, reduced to 1 cold K-ration per man per day. Water had to be melted from snow, a process that consumed precious fuel. The cold intensified. Temperature dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough that weapons required constant attention to prevent freezing. Men took turns warming rifles against their bodies, a necessary maintenance task that left them shivering but kept their weapons functional. Despite everything, the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, American spirits remained surprisingly high. Jokes circulated about being surrounded by Germans, those poor bastards, dark humor that served as psychological defense mechanism. Soldiers sang Christmas carols in defiance of their circumstances, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape in strange counterpoint to distant artillery. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. For the first time in days, the sun broke through heavy clouds, transforming the landscape into something almost beautiful. More importantly, clear weather meant air support. C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne, dropping supplies by parachute, while fighter escorts dealt with German interceptors. Mitchell stood in the church's ruined doorway, watching colored parachutes drift down across the town, red, yellow, green, each color coding different supplies. Ammunition, medical equipment, food. The supplies wouldn't end the siege, but they bought time. They proved that the garrison wasn't forgotten, that others fought to reach them. "We might actually make it," Russo said quietly, standing beside Mitchell. "We will make it," Mitchell replied, believing it now. "We've held this long. We'll hold until relief arrives." It was a promise to himself and his men, a commitment that transcended tactical necessity. They'd become something more than a military unit. They'd become brothers, bound by shared experience and mutual dependence. The German attacks on December 24th lacked the intensity of previous days. Intelligence suggested enemy forces were being redeployed, shifted to other sectors where the offensive continued. But the siege remained. German units still encircled Bastogne, still launched periodic attacks meant to keep defenders off balance. Christmas Eve found Mitchell's squad maintaining positions in the church, watching snow fall gently outside. Someone had managed to find and light candles, creating a warm glow that defied the cold darkness. Henderson produced a small bottle of brandy he'd been saving, pouring a careful measure for each man. "2 absent friends," he said quietly, raising his tin cup, "and to those who wait for us at home." They drank in silence, each man lost in private thoughts of people and places that seemed impossibly distant. Bulge produced a harmonica and played Silent Night with surprising skill, the notes achingly beautiful in their simplicity. Even hardened soldiers felt the sting of tears, though none would acknowledge it. Mitchell thought about Christmases past, his childhood in Iowa, midnight services at the small country church, his mother's cooking filling their home with warmth. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd be spending Christmas without him, probably attending services alone, probably praying for his safe return. The distance between them felt unbearable, but they were alive. Against all reasonable odds, his squad had survived days of combat that had killed or wounded thousands of others. They'd held positions that military theorists would study for decades, proving that determination and courage could overcome seemingly impossible situations. December 25th, Christmas Day, brought news that Patton's Third Army had broken through German lines and was advancing rapidly toward Bastogne. Relief was measured now in hours rather than days. The siege would continue, but its end was visible. The Germans launched one final major attack that morning, perhaps hoping to overrun the town before American reinforcements arrived. Artillery pounded defensive positions with renewed intensity. Infantry and armor coordinated in a final desperate push that tested every defender to their absolute limit. Mitchell's position at the church came under sustained assault. The Germans threw everything remaining into the attack. Tanks, infantry, even some artillery in direct fire role. The church's ancient walls, which had survived centuries of European warfare, now faced their ultimate test. A shell penetrated the south wall, exploding inside and killing 3 of the reinforcement soldiers instantly. Shrapnel wounded 4 others, including Russo, who took fragments in his leg and side. The Brooklyn Italian kept fighting anyway, his face pale, but his hands steady on his rifle. "I'm not dying in Belgium," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Not after coming this far, not this close to the end. Henderson directed fire from the remains of the bell tower, his Springfield picking off German officers with methodical precision. Walsh, despite his wounded arm, maintained devastating suppressive fire with the bar. Martinez fought with quiet intensity, his prayers now mixing English and Spanish in stream of consciousness supplication. Johnson had improvised another anti-tank device from grenades and ammunition, demonstrating the kind of innovative desperation that characterized the entire siege. When a panzer positioned itself for a clear shot at the church, he attacked again, repeating his previous near-suicidal assault. This time, enemy fire caught him, a burst that struck his legs and dropped him 30 feet from his target. Henderson didn't hesitate. He dropped his rifle, vaulted through a window, and sprinted toward Johnson's position. Bullets kicked up snow around him, but he reached the fallen soldier, grabbed him, and began dragging him back toward the church. Mitchell and Walsh provided covering fire that drove German infantry to ground. Martinez threw grenades that exploded with devastating effectiveness. Cooper, fighting through the pain of his own wound, added his rifle to the suppression. Between them, they created just enough chaos, just enough covering fire for Henderson to reach safety with Johnson. The teacher collapsed inside the church, gasping, his body shaking from adrenaline and exertion. Johnson's legs were badly wounded, bleeding heavily despite immediate field dressings. But he was alive, conscious, and in a strange way, smiling. "Got the tank," he gasped, pointing. And indeed, the panzer was burning, struck by a friendly artillery round that had found its target through the chaos of battle. Perhaps Johnson's attack had distracted the crew at a critical moment. Perhaps it was simple luck. Either way, the tank was neutralized. The German assault broke around noon, enemy forces withdrawing in good order but clearly abandoning their attempt to take the church. Mitchell's defenders had held, though the cost had been terrible. 3 dead, 6 wounded, including most of his original squad. They'd given everything, and somehow it had been enough. That afternoon, the distinctive sound of American tank engines reached them, Sherman tanks of Patton's Third Army finally breaking through to relieve Bastogne. The siege wasn't technically over. German forces would maintain pressure for days, but the critical phase had passed. The garrison had held long enough. Relief had arrived. Mitchell stood in the church's shattered doorway, watching American armored columns roll into town. Soldiers cheered, exhausted defenders finally allowing themselves to believe they'd survived. The sound of celebration seemed strange after days of combat, almost unreal. Henderson appeared beside him, his arm in an improvised sling from a shoulder wound Mitchell hadn't even noticed him sustain. "We did it, James. We actually did it." Mitchell nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything they'd endured settling on him like a physical burden. They'd held. They'd proven that courage and determination could overcome superior numbers and firepower. They'd embodied the best traditions of American soldiers: resilience, innovation, mutual support, and absolute refusal to surrender. "Everyone still with us?" Mitchell asked. "Johnson and Russo are being evacuated to the field hospital, Cooper's stable. Walsh is insisting he's fine, though he'll probably lose some functionality in that arm. Martinez, praying and counting his blessings." Henderson paused. "We lost 3 of the reinforcements, never even got their names." It was the tragedy of war reduced to its essence, men dying before you could learn who they were, before connections could form, before they became individuals rather than anonymous soldiers. Mitchell felt each loss like a physical wound, adding to the collection of scars he'd carry forever. The days following the relief of Bastogne passed in a blur of evacuation, medical treatment, debriefings, and the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy processing what had happened. Mitchell's shoulder received proper medical attention. He'd been lucky, the bullet passing through muscle without causing permanent damage. With rest and therapy, he'd regain full function. His squad was scattered through various medical facilities and replacement centers. Walsh was evacuated to England for treatment of his arm wound. Johnson required surgery to repair damage to his legs, but would eventually walk again. Russo's wounds were serious, but not life-threatening. Cooper's shrapnel injuries were healing slowly. Henderson received orders to report to division headquarters, where his demonstrated leadership during the siege resulted in a battlefield commission. The schoolteacher from Ohio became Lieutenant Henderson, though he insisted it didn't change anything between them. Mitchell spent 2 weeks recovering, his body healing faster than his mind. He wrote to Sarah, trying to explain experiences that defied explanation. "How did you describe holding impossible positions against overwhelming odds? How did you convey the strange clarity that came from facing death repeatedly and surviving through combination of skill and luck?" In his letter, he focused on the men he'd served with, on their courage and sacrifice. He told her about Henderson's devotion to his family, Johnson's innovative bravery, Russo's unshakable determination. He wrote about Walsh's youth and resilience, Martinez's quiet faith, Cooper's refusal to quit. He tried to make her understand that they'd become more than soldiers, they'd become brothers in the truest sense, bound by experiences that would connect them forever. The Battle of the Bulge, as historians would name the German offensive, continued into January 1945, before finally collapsing under Allied counterattacks. The siege of Bastogne became one of the most celebrated defensive stands in American military history, the garrison's refusal to surrender entering national mythology. Mitchell's squad received commendations, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, official recognition of their contribution. But the medals seemed almost irrelevant compared to what they'd actually accomplished. They'd proven something fundamental about American soldiers, about what ordinary men could achieve when pushed to extraordinary limits. When Mitchell finally returned to his unit in February 1945, he found himself reunited with most of his squad. They'd been reformed, reinforced with replacements who looked impossibly young and naive. The veterans, those who'd survived Bastogne, carried themselves differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they'd faced the worst and endured. Henderson approached him on the first day, still adjusting to his lieutenant's bars. Feels strange, doesn't it, being back, moving forward, when part of us is still there in that church? Mitchell understood completely. Part of them would always remain in Bastogne, in those frozen December days when survival seemed impossible, but they'd found the strength to continue. Those experiences had marked them permanently, had changed who they were at fundamental levels. "We carry them with us," Mitchell said quietly. "The men we lost, the things we did, the promises we made. We carry them forward and we honor them by continuing to fight, by refusing to let their sacrifice mean nothing." The war continued for another 3 months, carrying them through Germany and finally to victory in May 1945. Mitchell's squad participated in several more actions, but nothing matched Bastogne's intensity. They'd reached a peak of experience there, had touched something elemental about warfare and human endurance. When VE Day finally arrived, Mitchell found himself in a small German town whose name he'd forget within weeks. The celebration around him felt distant, almost unreal. His thoughts returned constantly to Belgium, to that church, to the men who'd held when holding seemed impossible. He wrote to Sarah that night, telling her it was finally over, that he'd be coming home. He tried to express what it meant: the relief, the exhaustion, the strange emptiness that came with surviving when so many others hadn't. He told her about Henderson's family, about how the teacher would finally return to his wife and daughter, about Johnson, recovering in a hospital but alive, about Rousseau, Martinez, Walsh, Cooper, all the men who'd become his brothers. The return home took months, processing through the military's demobilization system. Mitchell finally reached Iowa in August 1945, stepping off a bus in his hometown wearing his uniform and carrying a duffel bag that contained everything he owned. Sarah was waiting. She'd known he was coming, had probably been waiting at the bus station for hours. When she saw him, she ran, actually ran, closing the distance between them and throwing herself into his arms with enough force to make his still healing shoulder protest. They held each other in silence, years of separation and fear and hope finally resolved in simple physical contact. Mitchell buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of home and normalcy and life beyond war. "You made it," she whispered. "You actually made it home." "I told you I would," he replied, though they both knew how close that promise had come to being broken. The farm looked exactly as he remembered. Small, modest, but theirs. Sarah had maintained it alone, working dawn to dusk to keep everything running. Mitchell walked the familiar fields, feeling the Iowa soil under his boots, reconnecting with a life that had sustained him through the darkest moments. But he'd changed. The man who returned wasn't quite the same person who'd left. He carried Bastogne with him, carried the memory of that church and the men who'd held it. He dreamed of snow and artillery, woke sometimes in cold sweats thinking he heard German voices. Sarah understood without needing explanation. She held him during the nightmares, listened when he needed to talk, gave him space when silence was required. Slowly, gradually, he began to heal, not forgetting, never forgetting, but learning to live with memory rather than being controlled by it. Henderson visited in the spring of 1946, bringing Margaret and Emma. The 2 sergeants, lieutenant now for Henderson though he'd left the army, sat on Mitchell's porch, drinking beer and watching their wives chat in the yard. Emma played with a determination that reminded Mitchell painfully of Cooper, the Montana kid who'd fought through his wounds. "Johnson's doing well," Henderson reported. "Walks with a cane, probably always will, but he's alive. Married a nurse from the hospital where he recovered. Rousseau's back in Brooklyn, working in his father's business. Martinez returned to Texas, sends letters occasionally. Walsh is in Chicago, going to college on the GI Bill. They sat in comfortable silence, two men bound by experiences that would remain forever incomprehensible to those who hadn't shared them. The church in Bastogne stood 3,000 miles away, but in important ways, they'd never really left it. "We did something that mattered," Henderson said quietly. "When I think about Emma's future, about the world she'll grow up in, I know we helped make that possible. Every hour we held in Bastogne was an hour that contributed to eventual victory." Mitchell nodded, feeling the truth of it. They'd been ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things, and they'd found within themselves the capacity to meet those demands. They'd proven that courage wasn't about being unafraid, it was about being terrified and fighting anyway, that patriotism wasn't abstract, it was concrete, immediate, expressed through actions rather than words. Years would pass, decades. Mitchell would raise children on that Iowa farm, would watch them grow and marry and have children of their own. He'd tell them carefully edited stories about the war, about Belgium, about men who'd become heroes through circumstances rather than choice. He'd attend reunions when possible, maintaining contact with the survivors of his squad. They'd grow old together, their numbers diminishing as time accomplished what German soldiers couldn't. But the bond remained, unbreakable, sustained by shared memory and mutual respect. On quiet winter evenings, when snow fell on Iowa fields, Mitchell would sometimes find himself transported back to December 1944, to that frozen Belgian landscape where 8 men had held a church against overwhelming odds. He'd remember Henderson's steadiness, Johnson's innovation, Rousseau's determination. He'd remember the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, and the strange transcendent moments when they'd touched something greater than themselves. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, please take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like these matter, and your engagement helps ensure they're never forgotten. He'd remember that they'd held. Against every reasonable expectation, they'd held, and in holding they'd contributed to something larger than any individual, the defeat of tyranny, the preservation of freedom, the validation of principles worth fighting for. Mitchell never claimed to be a hero. When people used that word, he'd deflect, insisting he'd simply done his job, that real heroes were the men who hadn't made it home. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen what the war had cost him, understood the price paid, not just in those Belgian fields, but in the years of nightmares and memories that followed. The church in Bastogne still stands today, restored and maintained as a memorial to the battle that raged around it. Plaques commemorate the units that fought there, the men who died there, the civilians who endured occupation and liberation. Tourists visit, taking photographs, trying to imagine what happened on those frozen December days. But no photograph, no historical marker, no textbook account can fully capture what Mitchell and his squad experienced. The cold that penetrated to bone, the exhaustion that made every movement an act of will, the fear that had to be acknowledged, accepted and overcome moment by moment. The bonds forged between men who depended absolutely on each other for survival. They'd been ordinary Americans, a farmer from Iowa, a teacher from Ohio, a Brooklyn Italian, a Texas Mexican, a Montana farm boy, a Chicago kid, a North Carolina hunter. They'd become extraordinary through circumstance, through training, through leadership, and ultimately through their own determination not to fail each other. Mitchell died in 1983, surrounded by family, his life a testament to service and sacrifice. Sarah buried him in the small cemetery behind the country church where they'd married, under an oak tree he'd climbed as a child. His headstone was simple: name, dates, rank, unit. But those who knew him understood it represented so much more. Henderson delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite tears he didn't try to hide. He spoke about friendship forged in fire, about courage that transcended individual capability, about men who'd faced the impossible and refused to break. He spoke about Bastogne, about that church, about 8 soldiers who'd held when holding seemed impossible. James Mitchell was my friend, Henderson concluded, his voice carrying across the assembled mourners. He taught me what leadership truly meant, not commanding from safety, but standing beside your men in the worst moments. He showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear control you. And he proved that ordinary Americans, when called upon, can accomplish extraordinary things. The survivors of Easy Company who could still travel attended the funeral. Rousseau, now grey-haired and walking with a cane. Martinez, his faith deepened by decades. Walsh, his arm still bearing limited mobility from that Belgian wound. Johnson had died 2 years earlier, his damaged legs finally giving out, but his widow came, carrying the Medal of St. Michael that Rousseau had given him in Bastogne. They stood together at the graveside, old men now, but for a moment they were young again, cold, scared, determined soldiers holding an ancient church against impossible odds. The decades melted away, and they were back in Belgium, bound by something stronger than time or distance. After the service, they gathered at Mitchell's farm, sharing stories that Sarah had heard countless times, but never tired of hearing. They spoke of moments she'd only known through letters. Henderson's sprint to save Johnson, Rousseau's refusal to quit despite his wounds, the improvised tactics that had kept them alive when military doctrine said they should have died. "He saved my life at least 3 times that I can count," Rousseau said, his Brooklyn accent still strong despite decades in the Midwest. "Probably more I didn't even know about. Every decision he made, every order he gave, was about getting us home alive." "He made us better than we were individually," Martinez added quietly. "When I was sure I couldn't continue, couldn't take another step or fire another shot, I'd look at him and somehow find the strength. He never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself." Sarah listened, piecing together fragments of experiences her husband had rarely discussed fully. She'd known the outline, the siege, the church, the desperate defense, but these men filled in details that Mitchell had kept private. Not from shame or trauma, though those existed, but from the simple difficulty of explaining experiences that transcended normal language. Henderson pulled her aside later, pressing an envelope into her hands. "James asked me to give you this if anything happened to him. He wrote it years ago, updated it occasionally, said you deserved to know everything, even the parts he couldn't say while he was alive." That evening, alone in the farmhouse they'd shared for 38 years, Sarah opened the envelope. Mitchell's handwriting covered multiple pages, neater than his usual scrawl, suggesting he'd written carefully, taken time to find the right words. The letter began, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And there are things I need you to understand about Bastogne, about what happened there, about the man who came home to you, and why he was different from the one who left." He wrote about the fear that never completely left, about nights when he'd wake certain he heard German voices or artillery fire. He wrote about the guilt of surviving when others hadn't, about the 3 replacement soldiers whose names he'd never learned but whose faces haunted his dreams. He wrote about the impossible decisions, sending Johnson on that near-suicidal attack, ordering Henderson to carry Cooper across open ground, choosing to hold positions when retreat might have saved lives. But he also wrote about the things that had sustained him, her letters, the photograph he'd carried, the vision of their life together that gave him purpose when purpose seemed impossible to find. He wrote about how the men of his squad had become brothers, how their mutual support had created something greater than individual capability. "I need you to understand," he wrote, "that what we did in Bastogne mattered, not just militarily, though that's how historians will record it. It mattered because we proved that ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, can find extraordinary strength. We prove that bonds between soldiers transcend individual survival, that you fight not just for abstract principles, but for the men beside you. We proved that courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. The letter concluded, I've carried Bastogne with me every day since December 1944. Sometimes it felt like a burden, weight I couldn't put down. But increasingly, as years passed, I came to see it as a gift, proof that I was capable of more than I'd believed possible, that when tested absolutely, I hadn't broken. I hope you can understand that the man who came home to you was forged in those Belgian fields, tempered by experiences that changed him fundamentally. I hope you can forgive the nightmares, the silences, the moments when I was present physically, but absent mentally. And I hope you know that loving you, building our life together, was the most important mission I ever undertook. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for making the return home worthwhile. All my love, always, James. Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding pieces of her husband that had remained mysteriously closed. She understood now why certain sounds made him flinch, why he'd insisted their children learn self-reliance and determination, why he'd maintained such close contact with his squad members across decades and distance. The years continued passing. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. The generation that had fought World War II, Tom Brokaw's greatest generation, aged and diminished. Henderson died in 1995, his daughter Emma reading from his journals at the funeral, sharing her father's perspective on events she'd only known through stories. Rousseau followed in 2001, Martinez in 2008. Walsh made it to 2015, dying peacefully in Chicago, surrounded by grandchildren who bore his determination, if not his wartime experiences. But the story of Easy Company's defense of that Belgian church lived on. Military historians studied their tactics, using the engagement as a case study in small unit leadership and defensive operations. The church itself became a pilgrimage site for students of military history, its walls bearing plaques that listed names and honored sacrifice. Sarah Mitchell lived until 2019, dying at 96 in the same farmhouse where she and James had built their life. Her children found boxes of letters in the attic, correspondence spanning decades, connecting the farm in Iowa to battlefields across Europe, linking the man who'd left to the one who'd returned. They found photographs, medals, military documents, and Henderson's journals that had been given to Mitchell years ago. They found, most poignantly, a small notebook in their father's handwriting, pages filled with names and dates and brief notations. Each entry documented a member of Easy Company, where they'd served, what they'd accomplished when they'd died. It was a memorial kept privately, a way of ensuring that none of the men who'd fought beside him would be forgotten. The final entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting that suggested Mitchell had added it shortly before his own death, read simply, "We held, against everything, we held, and in holding, we mattered." Those words became the inscription on a memorial stone placed near the church in Bastogne in 2024, the 80th anniversary of the siege. Representatives from the American, Belgian, and German governments attended the dedication, along with descendants of the men who'd fought there. Emma Henderson, now in her 80s herself, spoke about her father and the men he'd served with, about ordinary Americans who'd accomplished extraordinary things. "They didn't seek glory," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd assembled in the church's shadow. "They didn't ask to be heroes. They were simply men who, when tested, refused to break. They held this ground because they were ordered to, yes, but also because they'd become something greater than individuals, a unit, a brotherhood, a collective will that transcended personal survival." She paused, looking at the restored church walls that had sheltered her father during those desperate December days. My father wrote in his journals that the siege of Bastogne taught him what truly mattered, not grand strategies or political objectives, but the bonds between soldiers, the commitment to not failing the men who depended on you. He carried those lessons throughout his life, applied them as a teacher, passed them to his children and grandchildren. The men who fought here came from different backgrounds, cities and farms, different religions and ethnicities, different education levels and life experiences. But in this place, at this moment, those differences became irrelevant. They were simply Americans, standing together against tyranny, proving that determination and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Emma's words echoed across the decades, connecting present to past, honoring sacrifice that had enabled futures those soldiers might never have imagined. The world they'd fought to preserve had changed almost beyond recognition. The Cold War had come and gone, new conflicts had emerged, technology had transformed warfare and daily life. But the fundamental truth of what they'd accomplished remained constant. They'd held. 8 men, then 14, facing overwhelming numbers and firepower, had held a critical position through sheer determination and mutual support. They'd proven that courage wasn't abstract. It was concrete, immediate, expressed through small decisions repeated moment by moment under the worst possible conditions. The memorial stone bore 8 names: Mitchell, Henderson, Russo, Martinez, Johnson, Walsh, Cooper, and one unknown soldier whose identity had been lost to history, but whose sacrifice was honored nonetheless. Below the names, those final words from Mitchell's notebook: "We held, against everything we held, and in holding we mattered." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, a small group remained, descendants of Easy Company's soldiers, connected by inherited memory and shared reverence. They'd grown up hearing stories about Bastogne, about that church, about men who'd become legends in family narratives. Now they stood where those men had fought, trying to comprehend experiences that remained fundamentally incomprehensible to those who hadn't lived them. A young man, Mitchell's great-grandson, bearing his name and something of his features, placed his hand against the church's ancient stone wall. The same wall his great-grandfather had defended 80 years earlier. He tried to imagine the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, tried to understand what it took to hold when holding seemed impossible. But some things transcend imagination. Some experiences can only be approximated, never fully understood by those who weren't there. The true measure of Easy Company's achievement existed not in historical accounts or memorial stones, but in the lives they'd enabled through their sacrifice. Children raised in freedom, opportunities pursued in peace, futures built on foundations they'd helped secure. The story of 8 American soldiers holding a Belgian church in December 1944 represented something essential about the nation they served. Not perfection, certainly not that, but rather the capacity of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary challenges. It illustrated that courage emerged not from absence of fear, but from commitment to something larger than self. It demonstrated that leadership meant standing beside rather than behind, that brotherhood could overcome individual limitation, that determination could achieve what pure military logic suggested was impossible. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, Corporal David Henderson, Private First Class Anthony Russo, Private Samuel Johnson, Private Eddie Martinez, Private Tommy Walsh, Private Billy Cooper, and countless others whose names history has preserved or forgotten. They were America's best answer to tyranny's challenge, not because they were superhuman, but precisely because they weren't. They were farmers and teachers, mechanics and students, men with families and dreams and fears, who, when tested, found within themselves the capacity to hold. The church stands still today, restored and maintained, silent witness to what happened during those frozen December days. Its walls have heard prayers in multiple languages across centuries, have sheltered believers through wars and peace, have absorbed the hopes and fears of countless generations. But perhaps no moment in its long history was more consequential than those days in 1944, when 8 Americans transformed it from religious structure to fortress, when they made it mean something beyond architecture or faith, made it mean resistance, determination, courage. Visit Bastogne today and you'll find a town that remembers. Memorials dot the landscape, museums preserve artifacts, guided tours trace defensive positions. The town itself has become synonymous with American military valor, its name carrying weight in military academies and history classes around the world. But the true legacy of Bastogne exists not in museums or monuments, but in the example set by men like Mitchell and his squad. They proved what Americans could accomplish when tested absolutely. They demonstrated values that transcended military necessity: loyalty, courage, sacrifice, determination. They showed that ordinary people, given leadership and purpose, could achieve extraordinary things. Their story resonates across decades because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature: our capacity for courage in crisis, our ability to transcend individual limitation through collective effort, our potential to find strength we didn't know we possessed when circumstances demand it. These weren't professional soldiers who'd spent careers preparing for combat. They were civilians in uniform, men who'd left ordinary lives to serve extraordinary purpose. Mitchell returned to farming, Henderson to teaching, Russo to his father's business, Martinez to his Texas town, Johnson married and raised children despite damaged legs, Walsh earned his degree and built a career. Cooper returned to Montana's wide spaces. Each built lives that honored what they'd survived, lives that gave meaning to sacrifice by living fully and well. They didn't dwell constantly on Bastogne. That would have been unbearable. They moved forward, built futures, raised families, pursued dreams. But the church remained part of them always, a touchstone they returned to mentally in quiet moments, a shared experience that connected them across whatever distances separated their post-war lives. When they gathered for reunions, annually at first, then less frequently as age and distance intervened, they'd speak of it carefully, reverently, with the understanding of men who'd shared something profound. They'd remember the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, but they'd also remember the strength they'd found together, the brotherhood that had sustained them, the knowledge that they'd held when holding seemed impossible. "We were just doing our jobs," Mitchell would say when people called him a hero, deflecting praise with the habitual modesty of men who'd seen real heroism and didn't feel they measured up. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen the nightmares, understood the cost, recognized that doing your job under those conditions required heroism, whether you acknowledged it or not. The letters between squad members continued for decades: Christmas cards, birth announcements, occasional visits when circumstances allowed. They maintained connection because what they'd shared couldn't simply be forgotten or set aside. It remained part of who they were, foundational to their identities in ways they couldn't fully articulate but deeply understood. Henderson's journals, eventually donated to a military museum, provided extraordinary insight into the siege from a soldier's perspective. His teacher's instinct for documentation created a record that historians would mine for decades. Detailed observations about tactics, leadership, the psychological toll of sustained combat, the bonds between soldiers that made survival possible. One entry, dated December 26, 1944, the day after the siege effectively ended with the arrival of relief forces, captured something essential. "We held not because we were ordered to, though orders mattered. We held because we couldn't bear to fail each other. James Mitchell kept us focused, kept us fighting, kept us believing we could survive. but we kept him grounded, gave him reason to continue when every rational calculation said we should surrender or retreat. We became something greater than individuals, a collective will that refused to break. I understand now what the Greeks meant by brotherhood in arms. It's not metaphor, it's literal truth, forged in circumstances that strip away everything except what's essential. Those words, written by a tired teacher who just survived one of World War II's most celebrated defensive actions, captured the essence of what happened at that Belgian church. 8 men, then 14 as reinforcements arrived, became something greater than the sum of individual parts. They created, through shared experience and mutual dependence, a brotherhood that would endure until the last of them died, and beyond that, in the memories and stories passed to subsequent generations. The strategic importance of holding Bastogne has been analyzed extensively by military historians. The town sat at a critical road junction in the Ardennes, controlling access routes essential to German offensive operations. By holding Bastogne, American forces created a cork in the bottle, a fixed point that disrupted enemy logistics and prevented rapid exploitation of initial German gains. Every day the garrison held was a day that allowed Allied forces to respond, to reinforce threatened sectors, to organize counterattacks that eventually defeated the offensive. But strategy alone doesn't explain what happened at that church on Bastogne's northeast perimeter. Strategy doesn't account for Henderson's sprint to save Johnson, for Rousseau's refusal to quit despite his wounds, for Walsh continuing to fight with a bullet-shattered arm, for Cooper manning positions despite shrapnel in his leg, for Mitchell leading despite exhaustion and injury that should have incapacitated him. Those actions emerge from something deeper than tactical necessity, from bonds forged through shared hardship, from commitment to not failing comrades who depended on you, from the fundamental human capacity to find strength in crisis that we didn't know we possessed. They represented the best of American values, not abstract principles, but concrete actions that gave those principles meaning and weight. The 8 soldiers who initially held that church came from different backgrounds, brought different skills and perspectives, had different reasons for serving. But in that frozen Belgian landscape, those differences became strengths. Rousseau's Brooklyn street smarts, Johnson's mountain hunting skills, Martinez's mechanical aptitude, Henderson's teacher's methodical approach, Walsh's youthful energy, Cooper's steady reliability, Mitchell's natural leadership. Each contribution mattered, each capability essential to collective survival. They proved that diversity of background and experience, when unified by common purpose and mutual respect, created capabilities that homogeneous groups couldn't match. They demonstrated that American strength emerged not from uniformity, but from ability to forge unity from difference, to create shared purpose while maintaining individual identity. This lesson resonates beyond military history, speaks to fundamental questions about what makes nations strong, what enables people to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The answer, exemplified by Easy Company's defense of that Belgian church, lies in leadership that earns rather than demands respect, in bonds built through shared challenge, in commitment to collective success that transcends individual interest. Mitchell understood this instinctively, though he probably never articulated it philosophically. His leadership emerged not from rank or formal authority, but from demonstrated competence, from willingness to share danger rather than direct from safety, from care for his men's welfare that they recognized as genuine. He didn't order Henderson to carry Cooper. Henderson volunteered because Mitchell had created a culture where such sacrifice felt natural and necessary. Similarly, Johnson's improvised attacks on German tanks emerged from environment Mitchell created, one that encouraged innovation, that trusted soldiers' judgment, that valued initiative within framework of broader tactical objectives. Johnson felt empowered to act because Mitchell's leadership style fostered rather than suppressed individual contribution. These patterns, leadership through example, empowerment through trust, unity through mutual respect, characterized the best American military units throughout World War II and beyond. They represented a distinct approach that often puzzled enemies accustomed to more rigid hierarchical structures. German soldiers frequently commented on American soldiers' initiative and flexibility, their ability to adapt and improvise when situations changed. That adaptability saved Easy Company repeatedly during the siege. When the farmhouse became untenable, they extracted and moved to the church. When ammunition ran low, they made every shot count. When anti-tank weapons were exhausted, Johnson improvised. When standard tactics failed, they created new ones on the fly. They survived not by following doctrine rigidly, but by understanding doctrine's underlying principles and applying them creatively to unprecedented circumstances. Military academies studied the defense of Bastogne extensively, using it to teach leadership, tactics, logistics, and the psychological dimensions of sustained combat. But perhaps the most important lesson transcends military specifics. The demonstration that ordinary people properly led and unified by common purpose can accomplish extraordinary things. That courage isn't inherent trait, but decision repeated, moment by moment. That brotherhood emerges not from similarity, but from shared struggle and mutual support. Mitchell, Henderson, Russo, Martinez, Johnson, Walsh, Cooper, these names represent millions of Americans who served during World War II, who left ordinary lives to confront extraordinary challenges, who returned home changed but unbroken, who built the post-war world through same determination that had sustained them in combat. They were, collectively, the generation that defeated fascism, that created unprecedented prosperity, that handed subsequent generations opportunities they'd fought to secure. Their story, told through this particular squad's defense of this particular church, serves as reminder and inspiration, reminder of what previous generations sacrificed, of the price paid for freedoms we often take for granted. Inspiration regarding what we're capable of when tested, when unified by purpose larger than self, when committed to ideals worth defending. The church in Bastogne stands as testament to these truths. Its ancient walls absorbed fire meant to kill the men sheltering behind them. Its stones bore witness to courage and fear, determination and doubt, sacrifice and survival. It became, for those desperate December days, more than religious structure. It became symbol of resistance, proof that tyranny could be opposed, demonstration that determined defenders could hold against overwhelming odds. Visit today, and you'll find it peaceful, restored, serving again its primary purpose of sheltering believers. But look closely at certain stones, and you'll see marks. Chips from shrapnel, impacts from bullets, scars from explosions. The physical evidence of what happened there remains, subtle but present, waiting for those willing to look carefully, to remember, to honor. The generation that fought World War II has nearly passed. The last veterans are in their late 90s now, memory of direct experience fading, as time claims even the youngest who served. Soon all we'll have are records, written accounts, photographs, artifacts, stories passed to descendants. The living connection to those events will be severed, and history will become purely historical rather than partly personal. This makes preservation and transmission of stories like Easy Company's defense of that Belgian church increasingly critical. These aren't just military histories or tactical case studies. They're foundational narratives about who we are as Americans, about values we claim to represent, about capacities we possess when circumstances demand them. They're proof that ordinary people can be extraordinary, that courage exists alongside fear, that sacrifice for larger purpose gives individual life meaning and weight. Mitchell understood this toward the end of his life, understood that his experiences carried lessons subsequent generations needed to learn. That's why he maintained his private memorial notebook, why he updated Henderson's journals with information about squad members' post-war lives, why he finally wrote that letter to Sarah explaining what Bastogne had meant and why it continued mattering decades after the shooting stopped. He wanted his children and grandchildren to understand that freedom isn't free, hoary cliché made real through lived experience. That democracy requires defenders willing to stand against tyranny even when standing seems impossible. That American values, imperfectly realized, always requiring renewed commitment, represent ideals worth serving, worth sacrificing for, worth preserving for generations yet unborn. The story ends, as all stories must, with silence, the silence of graves in American cemeteries across Europe and at home, the silence of memorials that mark where ordinary Americans accomplished extraordinary things, the silence of winter mornings in Belgium, where snow still falls on ancient churches and the wind still whispers through Ardennes forests. But silence isn't absence. It's space for reflection, for remembrance, for commitment to honor sacrifice by living well and purposefully. It's recognition that we stand on foundations others built, that our freedoms were purchased by previous generations' courage, that we inherit not just benefits, but responsibilities. 8 American soldiers held a Belgian church in December 1944. They held against overwhelming odds. They held when military logic said they should fail. They held because they'd become brothers, because they trusted their leader, because they represented something larger than themselves. They held, and in holding they mattered, not just militarily, not just historically, but morally and spiritually. They proved that courage could overcome fear, that determination could defeat despair, that ordinary Americans possessed extraordinary strength when properly led and united by common purpose. Their story lives on, in monuments and museums, in history books and family narratives, in the restored church that still stands in Bastogne, in the example they set for subsequent generations. It lives because it speaks truth about human nature and American character, because it demonstrates what's possible when we're tested, because it reminds us of capacities we possess but too rarely summon. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell died believing he'd simply done his duty, but duty performed under those circumstances, sustained through those trials, maintained despite injury and exhaustion and every rational reason to quit, that transcended simple obligation. It represented the highest expression of service, the purest form of patriotism, the most complete demonstration of American values. He and his men held. Against everything they held, and in holding they secured not just military objectives, but moral victory, proof that tyranny could be resisted, that determined defenders would not yield, that freedom was worth defending at any cost. That legacy endures, will endure as long as their story is told, as long as we remember what they accomplished and why it mattered. The church bells ring still in Bastogne, marking hours and calling faithful to prayer. They ring across landscape that once echoed with artillery and small arms fire, ring where American soldiers proved what courage and determination could accomplish. They ring in remembrance, in gratitude, in commitment to never forget the price others paid so we might live free. We hold these truths because they held that ground. We enjoy these freedoms because they refused to yield. We inherit this legacy because they fulfilled their duty beyond any reasonable expectation. Their story is American story, ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, finding strength in unity, proving that courage and determination matter more than numbers or firepower. 8 soldiers, held a church. Simple statement of fact. But within that simplicity lives complexity, fear overcome, exhaustion transcended, pain endured, brotherhood forged, sacrifice offered, duty fulfilled. Within that simplicity lives everything essential about American military service, everything fundamental about what enables free people to remain free. They held, we remember, and in remembering, we honor. Not just them, but the ideals they served, the values they defended, the future they secured through their sacrifice. Their names are written on stone in Bastogne, in records at military archives, in family histories passed generation to generation. But more importantly, they're written on the larger story of American democracy, permanent testament to what ordinary citizens can accomplish when called to defend extraordinary principles. The snow still falls on Belgium in December. The Ardennes forests still stand silent in winter cold. The church still shelters believers and honors sacrifice. And somewhere in Iowa, on a small farm that was home to a sergeant who once held impossible ground, the wind whispers through fields he planted and harvested, carrying memory forward, ensuring that what was held then remains held now. That sacrifice then enables freedom now, that courage then inspires courage still. We hold because they held, we stand because they stood, we are free because they fought. This is their legacy, their gift, their permanent contribution to the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. Simple truth, profound implication. 8 American soldiers held a Belgian church in December 1944, and in holding, changed history.